In 35 years of police work, I've walked into crime scenes that would haunt most people for life. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I found at 8763 Wonderland Avenue on July 1, 1981. My name is Detective Frank Martinez, and I was the lead investigator on what became known as the Wonderland Murders. What happened in that blood-soaked house in Laurel Canyon wasn't just another drug deal gone wrong. It was a massacre so brutal, so methodically savage, that it redefined everything we thought we knew about organized crime in Hollywood. For people were beaten to death with such violence that the coroner said it looked like they'd been hit by a freight train. The walls were painted red. Brain matter hung from the ceiling. And in the middle of it all sat one survivor, a woman so disfigured that we couldn't identify her for hours. But here's what kept me awake for decades. This wasn't random violence. This was a message. And the man who ordered it? He was already dead by the time we figured out what really happened. You think you know about the dark side of Hollywood? You haven't heard anything yet. Because what I'm about to tell you involves porn king John Holmes, the most violent drug lord in Los Angeles history, and a robbery so audacious that it triggered the bloodiest revenge in California criminal history. This is the true story that Hollywood doesn't want you to know. The story of how greed, addiction, and desperation turned a simple drug heist into America's most shocking quadruple homicide. The Wonderland House wasn't just any address in Laurel Canyon. It was headquarters for one of the most successful cocaine distribution networks on the West Coast. Four men lived there: Ron Launius, the violent ex-convict who ran the operation; Billy Dave Arale, his business partner and muscle; David Lind, a biker with connections to the Aryan Brotherhood; and Joy Miller, Launius's girlfriend who kept the books. These weren't your typical Hollywood drug dealers selling to actors and musicians. These were serious criminals with serious connections, moving serious weight. But they made one fatal mistake. They got greedy. And when you get greedy in the drug business, especially in 1981 Los Angeles, you don't just lose your money. You lose your life. The story really begins 3 days before the murders, on June 28, 1981. That's when the Wonderland gang decided to rob Eddie Nash. Now, if you don't know who Eddie Nash was, let me educate you. Nash wasn't just another drug dealer. He was the Palestinian-born nightclub owner who controlled the cocaine trade in half of Los Angeles. He owned the famous Starwood nightclub, had connections to organized crime families across the country, and was known for his philosophy: cross me once, and I'll destroy everything you've ever loved. Nash was also the employer and sometime lover of John Holmes, the legendary porn star whose 14-inch anatomy had made him famous worldwide. By 1981, Holmes was a shadow of his former self, a freebasing cocaine addict who owed Nash thousands of dollars and would do anything for his next hit. This is where our story gets complicated, because Holmes wasn't just Nash's debtor. He was also connected to the Wonderland gang through his girlfriend Dawn Schiller and his drug habit. The robbery itself was almost comically easy. Using information that Holmes had provided about Nash's security systems and daily routines, the Wonderland gang walked into Nash's Dona Lola Drive home on the evening of June 28. They tied up Nash and his bodyguard Gregory Dials, pistol-whipped them for the combination to Nash's safe, and walked away with over $1 million in cash, jewelry, and drugs. It was the largest residential robbery in Los Angeles history at that time. But here's what the Wonderland gang didn't understand about Eddie Nash: he didn't just get mad. He got even. And when Eddie Nash got even, people died. Before we continue with this story of revenge and murder, I need you to do something for me. If you're fascinated by true crime cases like this, cases where the official story doesn't match what really happened, then hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because what I'm about to tell you next involves police corruption, witness intimidation, and a cover-up that went all the way to the mayor's office. You won't find this information anywhere else, and I guarantee you won't be able to stop watching. Within hours of the robbery, Nash knew exactly who had hit him. His network of informants throughout Hollywood's drug underworld made it impossible to keep secrets, and John Holmes's involvement made the whole thing obvious. But Nash didn't rush into revenge. He planned it. He thought about it. He designed it to send a message that would echo through Los Angeles's criminal community for decades. Nash's first move was to have Holmes picked up. On June 30th, two of Nash's enforcers, Gregory Dials and David Lind, who had actually participated in the robbery but was now playing both sides, brought Holmes to Nash's new hideout. What happened next has been the subject of speculation for 40 years, but I'll tell you what I believe based on the evidence we collected. Holmes was given a choice. He could identify everyone involved in the robbery and help Nash get his revenge, or Nash would kill Holmes's girlfriend Dawn Schiller and then kill Holmes himself. It wasn't really a choice at all. Holmes agreed to cooperate, but what he didn't know was that Nash had already decided everyone connected to the robbery had to die. Holmes included. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Holmes would go to the Wonderland house on July 1st under the pretense of hanging out and getting high. He would leave the back door unlocked. Then Nash's crew would enter and eliminate everyone inside. Clean, simple, final. But murder is never as clean or simple as it seems in the planning stages. At approximately 3 a.m. on July 1, 1981, Holmes left the Wonderland house after making sure the back door was unlocked. Minutes later, Nash's hit squad entered, Gregory Dials wielding a steel pipe, and at least 2 other men whose identities remain unknown to this day. What happened next was so violent that seasoned homicide detectives requested transfers rather than continue working the case. Ron Lonius was beaten to death in his bed, his skull caved in with such force that fragments were embedded in the headboard. Billy Dave Arale was killed in the living room, his face so destroyed that we had to identify him through dental records. David Lynn should have been there, but he was at his girlfriend's house. A stroke of luck that saved his life and gave us our only inside witness to the gang's operations. Joy Miller was beaten unconscious and died at the hospital 3 days later, never regaining consciousness. The most horrific discovery was Joy Miller's roommate, Susan Lonius, Ron's estranged wife. She had been beaten with such systematic brutality that she had multiple skull fractures, a broken jaw, and brain damage. But somehow, impossibly, she survived. When we found her 12 hours later, she was still breathing, still fighting for life despite injuries that should have killed her instantly. The crime scene itself was unlike anything I'd encountered in 3 decades of police work. Blood covered every surface: walls, ceiling, furniture. The weapons used were so heavy and wielded with such force that they left indentations in the hardwood floors. The coroner later told me that the attackers had continued beating the victims long after they were dead, suggesting a level of rage that went beyond simple murder for money. But here's what bothered me from day one. The scene was too clean in some ways and too messy in others. Certain areas had been wiped down, suggesting the killers had taken time to eliminate evidence. But other areas were left covered in blood and fingerprints. It was like they wanted us to find some clues while hiding others. This wasn't the work of professional hit men. This was the work of people who were improvising as they went along. The investigation began immediately, but we ran into problems from the very first day. The LAPD was dealing with budget cuts, political pressure from the mayor's office to clean up Hollywood's image, and a media circus that made it almost impossible to conduct interviews or follow leads without reporters interfering. Worse, we quickly discovered that several key witnesses were either dead, missing, or too terrified to talk. Our first break came from David Lind, the only Wonderland gang member who survived because he wasn't at the house that night. Lind agreed to cooperate, but his story kept changing. First he claimed he didn't know who might have done it. Then he admitted he knew about the Nash robbery, but insisted he wasn't involved. Finally, under pressure and facing charges for unrelated crimes, he told us the truth. He had participated in the robbery, he knew Nash was planning revenge, and he believed John Holmes had set up his own friends to be murdered. But Lynn's cooperation came with a price. Within a week of agreeing to testify, someone shot up his girlfriend's house with automatic weapons. The message was clear: talk to the police and die. Lind immediately recanted his statement and disappeared into the witness protection program, leaving us without our most important witness. Our second break came from an unexpected source: John Holmes himself. 3 days after the murders, Holmes was arrested for questioning. His story was simple and consistent. He had been at the Wonderland house earlier that evening to buy drugs, he had left around midnight, and he knew nothing about who might have killed his friends. But his story had problems. Big problems. First, Holmes's alibi for the time of the murders was Sharon Holmes, his estranged wife, who claimed he was at her apartment. But Sharon's story kept changing, and she was clearly terrified of something, or someone. Second, Holmes had fresh cuts and bruises that he claimed came from a bicycle accident, but the pattern of injuries suggested he had been in a fight. Third, and most damning, Holmes's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, a steel pipe that had been used to beat the victims to death. When confronted with the fingerprint evidence, Holmes finally admitted he had been present during the murders, but claimed he was forced to participate under threat of death. According to Holmes, Nash's men had kidnapped him, driven him to the Wonderland house, and forced him to watch while they killed his friends. He claimed he touched the murder weapon when one of the killers handed it to him and ordered him to finish the job, but that he refused and was beaten unconscious. Holmes's story had elements of truth, but it was clearly designed to minimize his own involvement. The physical evidence suggested he had been present during the murders and had participated in some way, but we couldn't prove he had been a willing participant versus a coerced one. Without David Lynn's testimony and with no other witnesses willing to come forward, we had a case that was strong on circumstantial evidence but weak on proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The district attorney's office decided to prosecute Holmes for the murders, but they knew it would be difficult to get a conviction. Holmes hired one of Los Angeles's most expensive criminal defense attorneys, who immediately began attacking the credibility of the police investigation and suggesting that Holmes was being used as a scapegoat for a crime committed by more powerful people who couldn't be touched. This brings me to the part of the story that still makes me angry 40 years later, the Eddie Nash problem. Everyone knew Nash had ordered the Wonderland murders. The motive was obvious. The method fit his pattern of dealing with people who crossed him, and multiple witnesses had seen Nash's enforcers preparing for some kind of retaliation in the days following the robbery. But Nash was untouchable. He had connections to organized crime families, corrupt politicians, and law enforcement officials who owed him favors. More importantly, he had enough money to make problems disappear. When we tried to get a warrant to search Nash's properties, we were told there wasn't enough evidence. When we requested authorization for surveillance, we were told it wasn't in the budget. When we asked to bring Nash in for questioning, we were told he was represented by counsel and had declined to be interviewed. Every avenue of investigation that led toward Nash was blocked by red tape, politics, and what I now believe was deliberate sabotage from within the department itself. But Nash made one mistake that would eventually catch up with him. He kept Gregory Diles around. Diles was Nash's primary enforcer, a 300-pound ex-convict who had been present at every major act of violence Nash ordered throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Diles was also the person witnesses identified as the primary killer at the Wonderland house. If we could flip Diles, we could get Nash. But Diles wasn't talking, and Nash was making sure he had every reason to stay loyal. The John Holmes trial began in March 1982, almost 9 months after the murders. The prosecution's case was built around the physical evidence placing Holmes at the scene and his admitted presence during the killings. The defense strategy was to portray Holmes as another victim, a man whose drug addiction had made him vulnerable to manipulation by more dangerous criminals. Holmes took the stand in his own defense, and I have to admit, he was convincing. He described in detail how Nash's men had kidnapped him, threatened to kill his girlfriend, and forced him to participate in the murders under threat of death. He broke down crying when describing the moment he realized his friends were going to die and there was nothing he could do to save them. The jury was clearly moved by his testimony. But the prosecution had problems beyond just Holmes's compelling testimony. Key evidence had been contaminated or lost. Witnesses had disappeared or recanted their statements. The crime scene had been compromised by media attention and inadequate police resources. After deliberating for 3 days, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on all charges. Holmes walked out of the courthouse a free man, but freedom didn't last long. His cocaine addiction had destroyed his career, his health, and his relationships. Within 2 years, he was diagnosed with HIV, probably contracted through sharing needles while using drugs. He died in 1988, taking whatever secrets he still held about the Wonderland murders to his grave. But the story doesn't end there. Because while Holmes was dying of AIDS and trying to resurrect his porn career, Eddie Nash was building a criminal empire that would make his early drug dealing look like a corner store operation. I need to pause here for a moment and ask you something. Are you starting to see how deep this conspiracy really goes? How many powerful people had reasons to make sure the truth about the Wonderland murders never came out? If you're realizing that this case represents everything wrong with how justice works when money and power are involved, then you need to let other people know about it. Hit that like button, share this video, and make sure the algorithm knows that people want to hear the real story about what happened in Hollywood in 1981. By 1990, nearly a decade after the Wonderland murders, new evidence began to surface that changed everything we thought we knew about the case. The first break came from an unexpected source. Federal investigators working organized crime cases in Las Vegas and Miami discovered that Eddie Nash's operation was much larger and more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Nash wasn't just a local Los Angeles drug dealer. He was a major distributor connected to international smuggling networks, money laundering operations, and corruption schemes that reached into multiple police departments, courts, and political offices. The Wonderland murders weren't just revenge for a robbery. They were part of a larger pattern of violence Nash used to maintain control over his territory and send messages to potential competitors. Federal investigators also discovered that Nash had been paying protection money to several LAPD officers, including at least one detective who had worked on the Wonderland case. This explained why our investigation had been sabotaged at every turn and why Nash had seemed untouchable despite overwhelming evidence of his involvement in multiple murders. Armed with federal resources and jurisdiction that couldn't be blocked by local politics, investigators began building a comprehensive case against Nash for racketeering, drug trafficking, and murder. But Nash was still dangerous, still protected, and still willing to kill anyone who threatened his operation. The breakthrough came in 1999, when Gregory Diles was arrested on unrelated charges and faced spending the rest of his life in prison. 18 years after the Wonderland murders, Diles finally decided to cooperate with authorities. His testimony provided the first detailed insider account of how Nash planned and executed the massacre. According to Diles, Nash spent 2 days planning the murders, personally selecting the weapons that would be used and specifying that the killings needed to be brutal enough to serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider robbing him. Nash had initially planned to kill Holmes as well, but decided at the last minute that Holmes might be more useful alive as a witness who could spread word of what happened to people who crossed Eddie Nash. Diles also revealed that Nash had paid bribes to ensure that certain evidence would be lost or contaminated, that key witnesses would be intimidated into silence, and that the investigation would be closed without charges being filed against Nash or his organization. The corruption was so extensive that it included judges, prosecutors, and federal agents in addition to local police officers. Based on Diles's testimony and 18 years of accumulated evidence, Eddie Nash was finally charged with the Wonderland murders in 2000. He was 71 years old, in declining health, and no longer the powerful crime boss who had terrorized Los Angeles for decades. But he was still fighting the charges with expensive lawyers and appeals that dragged the case through the courts for years. Nash's trial began in 2001, 20 years after the murders. The prosecution's case was built around Diles's testimony, physical evidence that had been preserved despite the corruption, and a pattern of similar violent acts that Nash had ordered throughout his criminal career. The defense argued that Diles was lying to reduce his own sentence and that Nash was being prosecuted for crimes committed by other people who were now dead or beyond the reach of justice. The trial lasted 6 months and featured testimony from dozens of witnesses, including several who had been too frightened to come forward 20 years earlier. The jury heard details about Nash's organization that painted a picture of systematic violence, corruption, and intimidation that had allowed him to operate with impunity for decades. But the passage of time had created problems for the prosecution. Key witnesses had died, evidence had deteriorated, and memories had faded. After deliberating for 5 days, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on the murder charges, although Nash was convicted on several drug-related charges that sent him to prison for 10 years. Nash served his sentence and was released in 2012. He died in 2014, taking whatever remaining secrets about the Wonderland murders and his other crimes to his grave. Gregory Diles died in prison in 2008, still serving time for his cooperation in multiple murders. Susan Launius, the sole survivor of the Wonderland massacre, suffered permanent brain damage from her injuries and never fully recovered her memory of the night her friends were killed. She lived in assisted care facilities for years, supported by victim compensation funds and donations from people who had followed her story. She died in 2006, 25 years after the attack that destroyed her life. Today, the Wonderland house still stands at 8763 Wonderland Avenue in Laurel Canyon. It's been sold multiple times, renovated, and occupied by families who may or may not know about the blood that was scrubbed from its walls in 1981. The neighborhood has gentrified, property values have skyrocketed, and new residents are more likely to be tech executives than drug dealers. But the legacy of the Wonderland murders lives on in ways that most people don't realize. The case exposed corruption in the LAPD that led to reforms in how major crimes are investigated. It demonstrated how organized crime had penetrated legitimate businesses and government institutions in Los Angeles. And it showed how the drug trade of the 1980s was changing from small-scale local operations to international networks with the resources and connections to corrupt entire police departments. The case also highlighted the human cost of the drug epidemic that was beginning to devastate American cities. John Holmes, Ron Launius, Billy Dave Arale, Joy Miller, and the other people destroyed by this case weren't cartoon villains or faceless criminals. They were human beings whose lives were ruined by addiction, desperation, and the violent culture that surrounds the illegal drug trade. As I reflect on this case 40 years later, what strikes me most is how preventable it all was. If the Wonderland gang hadn't gotten greedy and robbed Eddie Nash, people would still be alive. If Nash hadn't been so committed to violent revenge, he could have gotten his money back through other means. If the LAPD hadn't been corrupted by drug money, the killers might have been brought to justice before other people died. But perhaps most tragically, if American drug policy had focused on treatment and harm reduction instead of criminalization and incarceration, the entire drug culture that created the situation might never have existed. The Wonderland murders were a symptom of a larger problem that we're still dealing with today. What happens when we make common human weaknesses illegal and then abandon the people who need help to a black market controlled by violence? The official files on the Wonderland murders remain partially sealed, with some documents classified for reasons that have never been explained. The LAPD has released several reports over the years, but key evidence and witness statements are still withheld from public view. Federal investigators who worked on related cases have suggested that additional murders connected to Eddie Nash's organization remain unsolved, and that some of the corruption exposed by the Wonderland investigation was more extensive than what was ever prosecuted. There are also persistent rumors about other Hollywood figures who were connected to Nash's operation or who had advanced knowledge of the murders. Some of these rumors involve famous actors, musicians, and producers who were Nash's customers or business partners. Others suggest that organized crime families from other cities were involved in the drug networks that Nash controlled. None of these rumors have been substantiated with evidence that would hold up in court, but they continue to circulate in true crime communities and investigative journalism circles. What we do know for certain is that the Wonderland murders represented a turning point in Los Angeles criminal history. They marked the end of the relatively small-scale disorganized drug trade of the 1970s and the beginning of the large-scale systematic drug wars of the 1980s and 1990s. The level of violence, the degree of corruption, and the connections to organized crime that the case revealed will become the template for drug-related crimes throughout the decade. Before I finish this story, I want you to think about something. How many other cases like this are there? How many other times have money and power been used to cover up crimes and protect the guilty while innocent people suffer? The Wonderland murders happened because a system designed to protect citizens instead protected criminals, and the people responsible for that failure were never held accountable. If you found this story disturbing, if it made you angry about corruption and injustice, then I need you to do something. Leave a comment below and tell me, what other cases should I investigate? What other stories need to be told? Have you ever encountered corruption or cover-ups in your own community? Your engagement helps me reach more people with these stories, and it helps ensure that cases like the Wonderland murders don't get forgotten or swept under the rug. The Wonderland murders remind us that truth is often stranger and more disturbing than fiction. They show us that the line between law enforcement and organized crime can become dangerously blurred when money and power are involved. And they demonstrate that justice delayed is often justice denied, especially when the victims or people society has already written off as criminals or addicts. Ron Lonius, Billy Dave Arale, Joy Miller, and Susan Lonius weren't perfect people. They were drug dealers who made their living from other people's addictions. They were criminals who used violence to solve their problems. But they were also human beings who deserved justice when they were murdered, and they deserved a police investigation that wasn't sabotaged by corruption and politics. John Holmes wasn't a hero or a victim in this story. He was a man whose addictions and poor choices led him to betray people who trusted him and participate in their murders. But he was also someone who was exploited by more powerful criminals and abandoned by a system that could have helped him if anyone had cared enough to try. Eddie Nash was a monster who used violence and corruption to build a criminal empire and destroy anyone who got in his way. But he was also someone who operated with impunity for decades, because the systems designed to stop him were corrupted by the same money and power that made his crimes possible. As for me, I retired from the LAPD in 1995, 14 years after walking into that blood-soaked house on Wonderland Avenue. I've spent the years since then trying to understand how a case with so much evidence and so many witnesses could result in so little justice. I've talked to other detectives who worked similar cases, federal investigators who studied organized crime, and journalists who covered the drug wars of the 1980s. What I've learned is that the Wonderland murders weren't unique. They were part of a pattern of violence and corruption that defined American drug policy for decades. The same forces that prevented justice in this case, political pressure, police corruption, witness intimidation, and media manipulation, have prevented justice in hundreds of other cases involving organized crime and drug trafficking. But I've also learned that telling these stories matters. When people understand how corruption works, they're better equipped to recognize it and fight it. When people see the human cost of failed policies, they're more likely to support reforms that prioritize public health and safety over politics and profit. The Wonderland murders happened 43 years ago, but their lessons are still relevant today. They remind us that crime isn't just about individual bad actors, it's about systems and institutions that either support justice or undermine it. They show us that some of the most dangerous criminals are the ones who wear badges and sit in government offices. And they demonstrate that getting away with murder isn't just about avoiding arrest, it's about having enough money and power to corrupt the entire system designed to hold you accountable. That's the real story of the Wonderland murders. Not just what happened in that house on July 1, 1981, but what happened in the months and years afterward when the people responsible for solving the case decided it was more important to protect their careers and their relationships than to deliver justice for the dead. I've told you this story because I believe people deserve to know the truth about how their government and their police departments really work. I've shared these details because I think the victims deserve to be remembered as more than just statistics in a drug war that destroyed millions of lives. And I've revealed this information because I hope it will help prevent similar tragedies in the future. The house on Wonderland Avenue is quiet now. The blood has been cleaned up, the evidence has been filed away, and most of the people involved in this story are dead. But the systems that allowed the Wonderland murders to happen are still in place. The corruption that prevented justice is still possible. And the drug policies that created the violent culture responsible for these deaths are still destroying lives today. Until we're willing to confront those realities, until we're prepared to demand better from our institutions and our leaders, tragedies like the Wonderland murders will continue to happen. The names and addresses will change, but the pattern will remain the same: violence, corruption, cover-up, and injustice. That's why I'm telling you this story. That's why these cases matter. And that's why I need you to share this information with other people who care about truth and justice. Because the only way to prevent future Wonderland murders is to make sure everyone understands how the first one was allowed to happen, and how the people responsible got away with it for so long. The Wonderland murders: 4 people dead, 1 survivor destroyed, and a system of justice corrupted beyond recognition. This is the story they didn't want you to know. This is the truth they spent decades trying to hide. And this is why cases like this one continue to haunt everyone who cares about what really happened in the shadows of Hollywood's golden age.